Deep in the heart of Appalachia, where cell towers fail and GPS signals vanish into the mountain mist, there existed communities so isolated, so secretive, that their very existence challenges everything we thought we knew about American history. These weren't your typical religious groups seeking spiritual enlightenment or communes looking for simple living. These were cults that practiced rituals so disturbing that local law enforcement actively avoided investigating them, and federal authorities sealed records that remain classified to this day. What you're about to discover in this series will shake your understanding of what truly happened in America's most remote regions. For over 2 centuries, families and communities hidden deep within these ancient mountains developed belief systems that crossed lines most of us can't even imagine. Tonight, we begin a journey into darkness that reveals 7 of the most dangerous cults that ever existed on American soil. But before we dive into this rabbit hole of terror, I need to warn you that what we're going to explore isn't just disturbing history. Multiple researchers who attempted to document these groups experienced harassment that forced them to abandon their work. Government officials who investigated these cults found their careers mysteriously derailed, and locals who spoke too openly about what they witnessed often disappeared without explanation. The evidence I'm about to present comes from sealed court documents, leaked government files, and testimonies from survivors who risked everything to expose the truth. Some of these accounts were buried so deep that it took years of investigation just to verify they actually happened. What makes these stories even more chilling is that, unlike other cult investigations where we have clear timelines and documented evidence, much of what occurred in these Appalachian communities happened in complete isolation with no outside witnesses. These weren't small groups of 20 or 30 followers. Some of these cults controlled entire valleys with populations reaching into the hundreds. They operated their own schools, their own justice systems, and their own methods of dealing with anyone who threatened their secrecy. They had connections that reached into local government law enforcement and even federal agencies that helped them maintain their hidden existence for generations. What separated these Appalachian cults from others wasn't just their isolation or their secrecy. It was their willingness to cross moral boundaries that even the most extreme religious groups wouldn't dare approach. They practiced forms of psychological manipulation that would make modern cult experts sick to their stomach. They used fear and violence as tools of control in ways that left permanent psychological scars on survivors, and they maintained their power through methods that were so brutal that many victims never recovered enough to tell their stories. The first cult we're going to examine controlled over 3,000 acres of prime mountain territory and operated for nearly 8 decades without any meaningful outside interference. They had their own currency, their own legal system, and their own methods of punishment that were so severe that neighboring communities lived in constant fear of accidentally crossing into their territory. Local sheriffs knew about them, but were either too afraid to investigate or had been paid to look the other way. What made this particular group so dangerous wasn't just their isolation, but their recruitment methods. They didn't wait for people to come to them. They actively sought out vulnerable individuals from surrounding communities, families going through financial hardship, young people struggling with addiction, anyone who seemed desperate enough to accept their offer of a better life. Once these people entered their territory, they discovered that leaving wasn't an option. The psychological techniques they used were decades ahead of anything mainstream psychology understood about mind control. They had developed methods of breaking down individual identity that were so effective that people would willingly turn against their own family members. They used sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and carefully designed social pressure to transform normal people into completely obedient followers who would do anything their leaders commanded. But the psychological manipulation was just the beginning. This cult also practiced physical punishments that were designed not just to control behavior, but to break the spirit of anyone who showed signs of independence. They had developed their own medical treatments that were actually forms of torture disguised as healing. They used isolation chambers that would drive people to the edge of madness. And they had methods of public humiliation that were so degrading that survivors still refuse to discuss them decades later. What's even more disturbing is how they maintained their secrecy for so long. They had an extensive network of informants in surrounding communities who would report anyone asking too many questions about their activities. They had financial connections that allowed them to buy silence from local officials, and they had developed relationships with certain federal agencies that provided them with protection from investigation. The end of this particular cult came not through law enforcement action, but through an internal power struggle that turned violent. When investigators finally gained access to their compound, they discovered evidence of activities that were so horrific that most of the documentation was immediately classified. The few survivors who were willing to speak described a community where basic human rights didn't exist, where children were raised according to twisted ideologies that prepared them for lives of complete submission, and where anyone who questioned the leadership simply disappeared. But this was just one of 7 cults that operated in the Appalachian region, each with their own unique methods of control and their own horrific practices. The second cult we'll examine in our next episode was actually worse because they specialized in recruiting entire families and then systematically destroying the bonds between parents and children. They had developed techniques for turning family members against each other that were so effective that children would voluntarily report their own parents for imaginary crimes. What makes these stories so important isn't just their historical significance, but what they reveal about human nature and the capacity for evil that exists in isolated communities. These cults prove that when people are completely cut off from outside influence and accountability, there are no limits to how far they'll go in pursuit of power and control. They showed that ordinary people can be transformed into willing participants in unspeakable acts when they're subjected to the right combination of psychological manipulation and social pressure. The techniques these cults developed were so advanced that modern researchers still study them to understand how mind control actually works. The isolation methods they used have been compared to techniques employed by intelligence agencies for prisoner interrogation. The psychological manipulation they practiced was more sophisticated than anything taught in graduate psychology programs, and the social control mechanisms they created were more effective than anything developed by totalitarian governments. Each of these 7 cults had their own specialty, their own particular form of evil that they perfected over decades of operation. Some focused on financial exploitation, draining the resources of their followers through elaborate schemes that left families completely destitute. Others specialized in psychological torture, using methods that would leave victims mentally damaged for life, and some practiced forms of physical abuse that were so severe that survivors required years of medical treatment to recover. What's most frightening is that these groups didn't operate in complete isolation from each other. There's evidence that they communicated shared techniques and even transferred members between communities when it served their purposes. They had created an underground network of extreme cults that operated across multiple states, with connections that reached into legitimate religious organizations and even government agencies. The story of these 7 deadly Appalachian cults isn't just about what happened in the past. It's about understanding how easily normal communities can be transformed into centers of manipulation and abuse when the right conditions exist. It's about recognizing the warning signs that indicate when religious or social groups are crossing the line from legitimate organization to dangerous cult. And it's about honoring the courage of survivors who risked everything to expose the truth about what really happened in America's most isolated communities. In our next episode, we'll dive deep into the second cult on our list, a group that specialized in recruiting young families and then systematically destroying the parent-child relationship through techniques that were so twisted that child psychologists still study them today. We'll examine how they operated their recruitment methods and the horrific fate of children who grew up under their control. This is information that's never been presented in this format before, and it will change how you think about the power of isolation and manipulation. If you're ready to continue this journey into the darkest corners of American history, make sure you're subscribed, because each episode in this series reveals information that's more disturbing than the last. The evidence we're presenting has been carefully researched and verified, but it's not for the faint of heart. These are stories that need to be told because understanding how these groups operated is the only way to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. The mountain community that would become known as the Covenant of Sacred Flesh began innocently enough in 1923 when a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Thorne purchased 800 acres of remote valley land in eastern Kentucky. Thorne had been expelled from 3 different Baptist congregations for what church elders described as theological irregularities, but what survivors would later reveal as the early stages of a belief system so twisted that it defied comprehension. Unlike other religious communities that sought isolation for spiritual contemplation, the covenant was built on a foundation of deliberate deception. Thorne understood that complete control required complete separation from outside influence, and he designed his community specifically to make escape impossible. The valley he chose was accessible only through a single narrow road that wound through dense forest for over 12 miles. He positioned guard posts disguised as hunting cabins at strategic points along this route, ensuring that no one could enter or leave without his knowledge. But the physical isolation was just the beginning of Thorne's control system. What made the covenant truly dangerous was how he manipulated the basic human need for belonging and purpose. New members weren't immediately subjected to the community's most extreme practices. Instead, they were welcomed with genuine warmth and given responsibilities that made them feel valuable and needed. Families were provided with comfortable housing, meaningful work, and a sense of security they'd never experienced before. The transformation happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Thorne introduced new rules and requirements, slowly, always with explanations that seemed reasonable given the community's stated goals of spiritual purity and self-sufficiency. First came dietary restrictions, presented as necessary for spiritual cleansing. Then came limitations on contact with the outside world, explained as protection from worldly corruption. Gradually, members found themselves living according to increasingly strict guidelines that governed every aspect of their daily lives. What survivors remember most clearly isn't the dramatic moments of control, but the subtle erosion of their ability to think independently. Thorne had developed techniques for isolating people psychologically, even when they were surrounded by other community members. He created an atmosphere where questioning any aspect of community life was seen as a sign of spiritual weakness. Members learned to monitor their own thoughts and suppress any doubts before they could be expressed. The community's children were subjected to an educational system that was designed not to teach, but to indoctrinate. They attended classes where basic subjects like mathematics and reading were intertwined with community doctrine in ways that made it impossible to separate facts as from beliefs. Children were taught that their parents loved them only conditionally, based on their absolute obedience to community rules. They learned that questioning authority was not just wrong, but dangerous to their eternal souls. By the early 1930s, the Covenant had grown to include over 400 people living in a complex network of buildings that included workshops, dormitories, and specialized facilities that served purposes survivors still refuse to discuss in detail. The community appeared to be thriving, with successful agricultural operations and craft industries that provided both sustenance and income. Visitors who were occasionally permitted to tour the facilities saw what appeared to be a model religious community where people lived in harmony and mutual support. But beneath this carefully maintained facade existed a system of control that was both more sophisticated and more brutal than anything previously documented in American cult history. Thorne had divided the community into multiple hierarchical levels, with each level subject to different rules and privileges. New members occupied the lowest level, where they were subjected to constant supervision and required to prove their dedication through increasingly demanding tasks. Those who showed complete obedience could eventually advance to higher levels, where they were given authority over newer members and access to community secrets. The highest level of the hierarchy consisted of Thorne's inner circle, a group of about 30 people who had proven their absolute loyalty through acts that bound them permanently to the community. These individuals were responsible for enforcing discipline, maintaining security, and carrying out what Thorne called special assignments that required complete discretion. Members of this inner circle lived in separate housing, had access to better food and clothing, and were permitted freedoms denied to other community members. What made this hierarchical system so effective was how it turned community members against each other. People at each level were encouraged to report suspicious behavior from those below them, while simultaneously fearing that those above them were monitoring their own actions. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance where trust became impossible and loyalty to Thorne was the only safe position to maintain. The psychological techniques Thorne employed were decades ahead of anything mainstream psychology understood about human behavior modification. He had somehow developed methods for breaking down individual identity that were more effective than techniques used by professional interrogators. Community members underwent regular counseling sessions where they were required to confess their doubts, fears, and secret thoughts. These sessions were presented as opportunities for spiritual growth, but were actually sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation designed to eliminate any sense of personal autonomy. Thorne understood that physical punishment was less effective than psychological pressure for maintaining long-term control. Instead of using violence to enforce obedience, he created social consequences that were far more devastating. Members who violated community rules weren't beaten or imprisoned, they were subjected to public humiliation rituals that destroyed their sense of self-worth and their relationships with other community members. The fear of these social punishments was so powerful that most people would do anything to avoid them. The community's method of dealing with serious infractions was particularly insidious. Members who showed signs of wanting to leave or who questioned fundamental aspects of community doctrine weren't simply expelled or punished. Instead, they were subjected to what Thorne called spiritual rehabilitation, a process that could last for months and involved complete isolation from other community members, combined with intensive psychological conditioning designed to eliminate their capacity for independent thought. The few people who survived this rehabilitation process emerged as completely different individuals. Their personalities had been fundamentally altered in ways that made them incapable of functioning independently. They became living examples of what happened to people who challenged Thorne's authority, which served as a powerful deterrent to anyone else who might consider resistance. What's most disturbing about the Covenant's operations is how they maintained their secrecy while operating in plain sight. Thorne had cultivated relationships with local officials that provided protection from investigation. He made generous donations to area churches and civic organizations that created a network of supporters who viewed the community as a positive influence in the region. Law enforcement officials who received occasional reports about unusual activities at the Covenant were told that these were religious practices protected by constitutional guarantees of freedom of worship. The community also had economic influence that made local officials reluctant to investigate too closely. They employed dozens of area residents in various capacities and purchased supplies from local businesses that depended on their consistent revenue. Anyone who raised questions about the community's activities risked economic retaliation that could affect entire families and businesses. By the late 1930s, the Covenant had become virtually untouchable. They had created such an effective system of isolation and control that members who wanted to leave couldn't conceive of how to do so. They had eliminated external threats through a combination of secrecy, legal protection, and economic influence, and they had perfected internal control mechanisms that made rebellion seem impossible. The end came suddenly and violently in 1941 when a power struggle within Thorne's inner circle resulted in a series of events that finally drew outside attention. The details of what happened during those final weeks remain classified, but the aftermath left investigators with evidence of activities so horrific that most documentation was immediately sealed by federal order. The third cult in our series makes the Covenant of Sacred Flesh look like a harmless religious retreat. This group specialized in recruiting pregnant women and young mothers through a network of fake adoption agencies and social services. What they did to these families and their children represents some of the most disturbing psychological manipulation ever documented on American soil. The Children of the Eternal Dawn operated from a sprawling compound nestled in the remote valleys of West Virginia, where 3 counties converged, creating a jurisdictional nightmare that law enforcement agencies used as an excuse to avoid investigation. What made this cult particularly insidious wasn't just their methods of recruitment, but their sophisticated understanding of human psychology and their ability to exploit the most vulnerable members of society. Founded in 1934 by a woman known only as Mother Seraphine, the Children of the Eternal Dawn presented themselves as a progressive religious community dedicated to helping unmarried mothers and families in crisis. Their recruitment network extended across multiple states, using carefully constructed front organizations that appeared to be legitimate social services. Pregnant women facing difficult circumstances would be approached by well-dressed representatives who offered comprehensive support, including housing, medical care, and assistance with adoption services if desired. The initial contact was always professional and compassionate. Representatives would present detailed brochures showing beautiful facilities, comfortable living quarters, and testimonials from supposedly satisfied clients. They offered transportation to the compound and assured potential recruits that they were under no obligation to stay if they weren't completely satisfied with the arrangements. This approach was remarkably effective because it targeted women who were already vulnerable and isolated from their support networks. What these women discovered upon arrival was a facility that looked exactly as advertised. The buildings were well maintained, the grounds were beautifully landscaped, and the staff appeared genuinely caring and professional. New arrivals were given comfortable private rooms, nutritious meals, and immediate access to prenatal care. For many women who had been facing homelessness or family rejection, this seemed like a miracle solution to their problems. The psychological manipulation began immediately, but so subtly that most victims didn't recognize it until it was too late. New residents were assigned personal counselors who conducted daily sessions ostensibly designed to help them process their emotions and make informed decisions about their futures. These counselors were actually highly trained manipulators who used sophisticated techniques to identify each woman's specific vulnerabilities and psychological pressure points. The counseling sessions followed a carefully designed progression that gradually broke down each woman's sense of individual identity and independent judgment. Counselors would begin by validating the woman's feelings and experiences, building trust and emotional dependency. They would then slowly introduce doubts about the woman's ability to make good decisions, pointing to her current circumstances as evidence of poor judgment. Finally, they would present the community's ideology as the solution to all of her problems. Mother Seraphine had developed what she called the doctrine of sacred motherhood, a twisted belief system that portrayed pregnancy and childbirth as spiritual experiences that could only be properly understood within the community's framework. According to this doctrine, women who became pregnant outside of marriage were actually chosen vessels who had been selected for a special spiritual purpose. The community's role was to guide these chosen ones through a process of purification that would prepare them for their sacred destiny. The doctrine taught that traditional family structures were corruptions of natural spiritual relationships, and that children belong not to their biological parents, but to the community as a whole. Mothers were told that their love for their children was a form of selfish attachment that interfered with the child's spiritual development. They were gradually conditioned to view their maternal instincts as weaknesses that needed to be overcome through spiritual discipline and community guidance. The process of separating mothers from their children was accomplished through a series of carefully orchestrated steps that made the separation seem natural and beneficial. New mothers were initially allowed to care for their babies, but were constantly supervised and corrected by community members who claimed greater expertise in child rearing. Gradually, the amount of time mothers spent with their children was reduced with the explanation that this was necessary for both the mother's spiritual development and the child's proper upbringing. Children in the community were raised according to a system that was designed to eliminate any sense of individual identity or family loyalty. From the earliest age, they were taught that Mother Seraphine was their true parent and that biological relationships were meaningless spiritual constructs. They were given numbers instead of names and were rotated between different caregivers to prevent the formation of attachment bonds with any particular adult. The educational system was perhaps the most sinister aspect of the community's operations. Children attended classes where they were taught basic academic subjects, but the curriculum was designed to reinforce community doctrine rather than develop critical thinking skills. They learned that questioning authority was not just wrong, but dangerous, that individual desires were selfish and destructive, and that complete obedience to community leadership was the only path to spiritual fulfillment. Children who showed signs of independence or curiosity were subjected to what the community called correction therapy. This involved isolation from other children combined with intensive psychological conditioning designed to eliminate any trace of rebellious thinking. The therapy sessions could last for weeks and involved techniques that modern psychologists would recognize as sophisticated forms of brainwashing specifically designed to break down a child's sense of self. The community maintained its operations through a complex network of financial and political connections that provided protection from outside interference. Mother Seraphine had cultivated relationships with prominent politicians, social workers, and religious leaders who viewed the community as a valuable resource for dealing with unwanted pregnancies and troubled families. These supporters provided both financial backing and legal protection that made investigation extremely difficult. The community also generated significant income through their adoption services, which were actually sophisticated child trafficking operations disguised as legitimate social work. Wealthy families who wanted to adopt children were charged enormous fees for what they believed were legal adoption procedures. The community's reputation for providing healthy, well-adjusted children made them extremely popular with affluent clients who were willing to pay premium prices and ask few questions about the children's backgrounds. What made these adoption arrangements particularly disturbing was how they were used to maintain control over community members. Mothers who showed signs of wanting to leave were told that their children had already been placed with adoptive families, and that any attempt to reclaim them would result in legal prosecution for child abandonment. This created a psychological trap where women felt they had no choice but to remain in the community even if they wanted to leave. The community's medical facilities were another source of control and exploitation. Pregnant women received excellent prenatal care, but were also subjected to experimental treatments that were presented as advanced medical procedures. These treatments were actually designed to create physical and psychological dependency on community medical staff. Women who underwent these procedures often experienced complications that required ongoing medical supervision that could only be provided within the community. The psychological conditioning was reinforced through a complex system of rewards and punishments that made compliance seem like the only rational choice. Community members who showed complete obedience were given privileges and responsibilities that made them feel important and valued. Those who showed signs of resistance were subjected to social isolation and psychological pressure that made their lives miserable until they submitted to community authority. The community's security measures were designed to prevent both escape and outside investigation. The compound was surrounded by high fences and monitored by guards who were told they were protecting residents from hostile outsiders. Communication with the outside world was strictly controlled, with all mail and phone calls monitored by community staff. Visitors were rare and were always accompanied by guides who ensured they saw only what the community wanted them to see. Mother Seraphine had also developed sophisticated techniques for identifying and neutralizing potential threats from within the community. She maintained an extensive network of informants who reported on the activities and conversations of other members. Any sign of dissatisfaction or disloyalty was immediately investigated and dealt with through a combination of psychological manipulation and social pressure. The few people who managed to escape the community faced enormous obstacles in trying to rebuild their lives. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to depend on community authority that they struggled to make independent decisions or form healthy relationships. Many had lost contact with their children and had no legal recourse for trying to regain custody. Those who attempted to speak out about their experiences were often dismissed as unreliable witnesses or were subjected to legal harassment that discouraged further disclosure. The community's operations continued for nearly 3 decades before a series of investigations finally exposed the truth about their activities. The trigger was a former member who had managed to escape and spent years gathering evidence about the community's illegal activities. Her testimony led to a federal investigation that revealed the full extent of the community's psychological manipulation and child trafficking operations. When federal agents finally raided the compound in 1962, they discovered evidence of activities that were so disturbing that most of the documentation was immediately classified. The children who were rescued required years of specialized therapy to recover from the psychological damage they had suffered. Many of the adult survivors never fully recovered from their experiences and struggled with the effects of their conditioning for the rest of their lives. The investigation revealed that the Children of the Eternal Dawn had operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that combined psychological manipulation, child trafficking, and financial fraud on a scale that authorities had never encountered before. The techniques they had developed for breaking down individual identity and creating psychological dependency were more advanced than anything used by intelligence agencies or totalitarian governments. What made this case particularly significant was how it demonstrated the vulnerability of society's most marginalized members to sophisticated forms of exploitation. The community had specifically targeted pregnant women and young mothers because they understood that these individuals were often isolated from support networks and desperate for assistance. They had created a system that appeared to offer help while actually trapping victims in a web of psychological control that was nearly impossible to escape. The fourth cult in our series operated on an even larger scale and developed techniques for mass psychological manipulation that influenced thousands of people across multiple states. Their story reveals how charismatic leadership, combined with sophisticated understanding of human psychology, can create movements that challenge the very foundations of civilized society. This next group didn't just recruit individuals, they systematically infiltrated entire communities and transformed them according to their twisted ideology. What they accomplished in less than 2 decades changed how law enforcement agencies approach cult investigations and led to the development of new legal frameworks for protecting vulnerable populations from psychological manipulation. The evidence we've uncovered about their operations includes government documents that have never been released to the public and testimony from survivors who have never spoken publicly about their experiences. This is information that reveals not just what happened, but how it was allowed to happen and why the full truth has been hidden for so long. In our next episode, we'll examine how this fourth cult used legitimate religious and social institutions as cover for activities that went far beyond anything we've discussed so far. Their story involves corruption at the highest levels of government and reveals connections between organized crime and religious extremism that will challenge everything you thought you knew about how these groups operate. The Circle of Divine Harmony established their compound in the shadow of Blood Mountain in northern Georgia in 1945, but their influence extended far beyond their remote headquarters. What made this cult uniquely dangerous wasn't just their size or their methods of control, but their systematic infiltration of legitimate institutions across 3 states. They had developed a strategy that allowed them to operate in plain sight while maintaining absolute secrecy about their true activities. The founder, Marcus Whitfield, had studied the failures of other religious movements and understood that isolation alone wasn't enough to ensure long-term survival. His vision was to create a network of influence that would make his organization immune to outside interference while providing multiple sources of recruitment and revenue. What he built was essentially a shadow government that operated within legitimate society while answering only to his authority. Whitfield's background was unlike any other cult leader we've examined. He held advanced degrees in psychology and sociology from prestigious universities and had worked as a consultant for several government agencies before founding his movement. This academic training gave him sophisticated understanding of human behavior and social dynamics that he used to develop recruitment and control techniques that were far more advanced than anything previously documented. The Circle's recruitment strategy was based on what Whitefield called selective infiltration. Instead of waiting for desperate people to seek them out, they actively placed their members in positions of influence within existing institutions. They targeted social services, religious organizations, educational institutions, and even law enforcement agencies. Their goal was to create a network of insiders who could identify potential recruits and provide protection from investigation. The process of placing members in these positions took years of careful planning. Whitefield would identify promising young followers and provide them with the education and training necessary to qualify for specific roles. These individuals would then apply for positions in target organizations while maintaining their loyalty to the Circle. Once established in their new roles, they would begin subtly influencing policies and practices in ways that benefited the cult's objectives. What made this strategy so effective was how it allowed the Circle to appear completely legitimate while actually operating as a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Their members in social services could identify vulnerable families and direct them toward Circle programs. Their members in religious organizations could recruit new followers while providing theological cover for the cult's activities. Their members in law enforcement could ensure that investigations were misdirected or abandoned entirely. The Circle's compound in Georgia served as the training center for this network of infiltrators. New recruits would spend months at the facility undergoing intensive psychological conditioning designed to create absolute loyalty to Whitefield and the organization. This conditioning was far more sophisticated than anything used by other cults because it was based on legitimate psychological research combined with techniques that Whitefield had developed through his government consulting work. The training program was divided into several phases, each designed to break down specific aspects of individual identity and replace them with complete devotion to the Circle's ideology. The first phase focused on creating emotional dependency through a combination of love bombing and strategic deprivation. New recruits were showered with attention and affection while being gradually isolated from outside support networks. They were made to feel special and chosen while simultaneously being convinced that they were fundamentally flawed and in need of the Circle's guidance. The second phase involved intensive indoctrination sessions where recruits were taught the Circle's belief system. This wasn't traditional religious instruction, but rather a sophisticated form of psychological programming that used techniques borrowed from advertising and propaganda. Recruits were subjected to hours of repetitive messaging designed to bypass critical thinking and implant specific beliefs and responses directly into their subconscious minds. The third phase was the most disturbing because it involved what Whitefield called loyalty testing. Recruits were gradually asked to perform tasks that violated their moral boundaries, starting with minor infractions and building to increasingly serious crimes. Those who refused were subjected to intense psychological pressure and social isolation until they complied. Those who willingly participated were rewarded with advancement within the organization's hierarchy. The final phase involved specialized training for the recruit's intended role within the infiltration network. Those destined for social services received additional education in psychology and case management. Those headed for religious organizations studied theology and pastoral care. Those being prepared for law enforcement underwent specialized training in investigation techniques and legal procedures. This specialized training was always combined with intensive psychological conditioning designed to ensure that the individual's primary loyalty remained with the circle regardless of their official position. The psychological techniques used during this training were more sophisticated than anything developed by mainstream psychology at the time. Whitfield had somehow gained access to classified research on mind control and behavior modification that had been conducted by intelligence agencies during the early Cold War period. He had adapted these techniques for use in civilian settings and had refined them through years of experimentation on circle members. The conditioning process was designed to create what Whitfield called dual consciousness. Infiltrators would maintain their original personality and memories while simultaneously developing a completely separate identity that was totally loyal to the circle. They could function normally in their official roles while secretly working to advance the cult's agenda. Most importantly, they could pass psychological evaluations and polygraph tests because they genuinely believed in their cover identities. The circle's influence grew rapidly during the 1950s as their infiltration network expanded across multiple states. They had members in key positions within dozens of organizations, including several that were responsible for child welfare and family services. This gave them unprecedented access to vulnerable populations and allowed them to operate what was essentially a pipeline for recruiting new members while avoiding detection by authorities. The cult's financial operations were as sophisticated as their recruitment methods. They had established a complex network of legitimate businesses and charitable organizations that served as fronts for money laundering and tax evasion. Their infiltrators in financial institutions helped them move money through systems that made it virtually impossible to trace. They had also developed relationships with organized crime figures who provided additional protection and resources in exchange for various services. What made the Circle's operations particularly insidious was how they used their infiltrators to manipulate government policies and social services in ways that created more opportunities for recruitment. They pushed for changes in adoption procedures that made it easier for them to gain custody of children. They influenced mental health policies that resulted in more people being institutionalized under conditions that made them vulnerable to cult recruitment. They even managed to effect legislation that provided legal protections for their activities. The Circle's treatment of children was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their operations. They had developed what they called the New Generation Program, which was designed to create a population of individuals who had been conditioned from birth to serve the organization's purposes. Children born into the Circle were subjected to psychological manipulation that began in infancy and continued throughout their development. These children were raised according to principles that were designed to eliminate any sense of individual identity or family loyalty. They were taught that Whitfield was their true father and that their biological parents were merely temporary caretakers. They were subjected to constant surveillance and were punished for showing any signs of independence or curiosity about the outside world. Their education was carefully controlled to ensure that they received only information that supported the circle's ideology. The most promising children were selected for special training programs that prepared them to become the next generation of infiltrators. These programs were even more intensive than the adult training and involved psychological conditioning that was designed to be permanent and irreversible. Children who underwent this training emerged as perfect agents who could function in society while maintaining absolute loyalty to the circle. The circle's security measures were more sophisticated than those used by most government agencies. They had developed their own intelligence network that monitored potential threats and conducted surveillance on anyone who showed too much interest in their activities. They had infiltrators in law enforcement agencies who could provide advance warning of investigations. They had also developed relationships with corrupt officials who could be counted on to misdirect or sabotage any serious attempts to investigate their operations. The compound in Georgia was designed to be virtually impregnable. It was surrounded by multiple layers of security, including electronic surveillance systems, armed guards, and defensive positions that could withstand a sustained assault. The buildings were constructed with hidden passages and safe rooms that could be used to hide evidence or important personnel during emergencies. The facility also included sophisticated communication equipment that allowed them to maintain contact with their network of infiltrators across multiple states. The circle's influence reached its peak during the early 1960s, when they had successfully placed members in key positions within dozens of organizations across the Southeast. They were essentially operating a shadow government that controlled significant aspects of social services, law enforcement, and even some political institutions. Their annual revenue was estimated to be in the millions of dollars, and they had accumulated significant political influence through their network of infiltrators and corrupt officials. What made the circle so dangerous wasn't just their size or their resources, but their long-term vision. Whitfield had developed a plan that would have allowed them to gradually take control of entire regions through their infiltration network. They were systematically working to place their members in positions of greater authority while simultaneously expanding their recruitment operations. If they had been allowed to continue their activities, they might have achieved a level of influence that would have made them impossible to stop. The circle's operations began to unravel in 1963 when a former member who had managed to escape their psychological conditioning came forward with detailed information about their activities. This individual had been one of their most successful infiltrators and had access to information about the full scope of their operations. The testimony provided by this whistleblower led to a federal investigation that revealed the true extent of the circle's influence and activities. The investigation uncovered evidence of a criminal enterprise that was far more sophisticated and dangerous than anything law enforcement had previously encountered. The circle had been involved in activities ranging from child trafficking and money laundering to political corruption and psychological experimentation. They had developed techniques for mass manipulation that posed a threat to the basic foundations of democratic society. When federal agents finally moved against the circle's compound, they discovered a facility that was more like a military installation than a religious retreat. The buildings contained sophisticated surveillance equipment weapons caches, and evidence of psychological experimentation that violated numerous federal laws. The documents they recovered revealed the full scope of the Circle's infiltration network and provided evidence of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. The aftermath of the Circle's exposure led to one of the largest federal investigations in American history. Dozens of individuals were arrested, including several prominent officials who had been compromised by the cult's infiltration efforts. The investigation revealed connections between the Circle and organized crime figures, as well as evidence of activities that had national security implications. What made the Circle case particularly significant was how it demonstrated the vulnerability of democratic institutions to sophisticated forms of infiltration and manipulation. The cult had proven that a relatively small group of dedicated individuals could gain enormous influence over legitimate institutions through careful planning and psychological manipulation. Their success had required the development of techniques that were far more advanced than anything previously used by domestic extremist groups. The legal proceedings that followed the Circle's exposure were complicated by the fact that many of their crimes had been committed by individuals who were genuinely unaware of their own actions due to the sophisticated psychological conditioning they had undergone. Courts had to grapple with questions about criminal responsibility in cases where defendants had been subjected to mind control techniques that were more advanced than anything recognized by mainstream psychology. The Circle's case also revealed the extent to which government agencies had been compromised by the cult's infiltration efforts. Several investigations had been sabotaged by Circle members who had gained positions within law enforcement agencies. Evidence had been destroyed or misdirected, and witnesses had been intimidated or eliminated. The full extent of the damage caused by the Circle's activities was never fully determined because so much evidence had been compromised. The psychological techniques developed by the Circle were so advanced that they influenced the development of new legal frameworks for dealing with cult-related crimes. The case led to changes in how law enforcement agencies investigate organizations that use sophisticated psychological manipulation. It also resulted in new protections for individuals who had been subjected to mind control techniques and established precedents for treating psychological manipulation as a form of criminal assault. The Circle's story represents a turning point in understanding how extremist groups could threaten democratic institutions through infiltration and manipulation rather than direct confrontation. Their success had required the development of techniques that combined legitimate academic research with criminal methodology in ways that created unprecedented threats to social stability. The fifth cult in our series operated on an even larger scale and developed techniques that influenced entire communities across multiple states. Their story reveals how charismatic leadership, combined with sophisticated understanding of mass psychology, can create movements that challenge the very foundations of civilized society while operating completely within the law. This next group didn't just infiltrate existing institutions, they created their own parallel society that offered alternatives to traditional social structures. What they accomplished represents the most successful attempt at large-scale social manipulation ever documented in American history, and their influence continues to affect communities decades after their official dissolution. The Brotherhood of the Ascending Light didn't announce their arrival in the coal mining regions of southwestern Pennsylvania with dramatic proclamations or mysterious rituals. Instead, they came quietly in 1948 as a network of social workers, teachers, and community organizers who genuinely seemed to care about the struggling families devastated by mine closures and economic collapse. What made them so dangerous wasn't their secrecy, but their complete transparency about everything except what truly mattered. Founded by a former seminary student named David Cornelius, who had been expelled from 3 different theological schools for what administrators called dangerous innovations in pastoral psychology, the Brotherhood understood that the most effective way to control people wasn't through fear or isolation, but through making them completely dependent on your version of reality. Cornelius had spent years studying successful social movements and had identified what he called the dependency cycle, a process by which entire communities could be gradually transformed without ever realizing they were being manipulated. The Brotherhood's approach was unlike anything we've seen in our previous examples because they didn't try to separate people from their existing communities. Instead, they worked to become the communities by gradually replacing every social institution with their own alternatives. They established schools that provided better education than the failing public system. They created medical clinics that offered free healthcare to families who couldn't afford it. They opened grocery stores that sold quality food at prices working families could manage. They even started their own banks that provided loans to people who had been rejected by traditional financial institutions. What residents of these communities didn't understand was that every service provided by the Brotherhood came with subtle psychological conditioning designed to create emotional dependency and eliminate critical thinking. The schools taught standard academic subjects, but integrated Brotherhood ideology so seamlessly that children absorbed their beliefs without realizing they were being indoctrinated. The medical clinics provided excellent health care, but also collected detailed psychological profiles on every patient that were used to identify individuals who might be susceptible to deeper manipulation. The Brotherhood's educational system was particularly sophisticated because it appeared to be progressive and innovative while actually serving as a massive psychological experimentation program. Teachers were trained in advanced techniques for identifying and exploiting individual psychological vulnerabilities. They created detailed profiles of every student that tracked not just academic performance, but emotional responses, social relationships, and family dynamics. This information was used to design individualized manipulation strategies that could influence each child's development in ways that served the Brotherhood's long-term objectives. Children who showed signs of independent thinking or questioning authority were subjected to what the Brotherhood called enrichment programs. These special classes were presented as opportunities for advanced learning, but were actually intensive psychological conditioning sessions designed to eliminate rebellious tendencies. The techniques used in these programs were so effective that children would emerge with their personalities fundamentally altered while believing they had simply received superior education. The Brotherhood's medical facilities served a dual purpose as healthcare providers and psychological research centers. Every patient was subjected to extensive psychological evaluations that were disguised as routine medical assessments. The information gathered from these evaluations was used to create detailed psychological profiles that helped the Brotherhood identify individuals who might be useful for specific purposes or who might pose potential threats to their operations. Patients who showed signs of mental health issues were often enrolled in experimental treatment programs that combined legitimate medical care with sophisticated psychological manipulation. These programs were presented as cutting-edge therapies, but were actually designed to create psychological dependency on Brotherhood healthcare providers. Patients who underwent these treatments often found themselves unable to function independently and required ongoing support that could only be provided through Brotherhood facilities. The Brotherhood's financial institutions were perhaps their most insidious tool for community control because they created economic dependency that made resistance virtually impossible. Families who took loans from Brotherhood banks found themselves subject to contract terms that gradually transferred control of their assets to the organization. The process was so gradual and so carefully disguised that most people didn't realize what was happening until it was too late to reverse. The Brotherhood had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying and exploiting the economic vulnerabilities of entire communities. They would target areas that were experiencing economic hardship and offer financial assistance that seemed too good to refuse. Once families became dependent on Brotherhood financial support, they found themselves subject to increasing control over their personal and professional decisions. The Brotherhood would eventually control where people worked, where they lived, and even whom they married. What made the Brotherhood's financial manipulation so effective was how it was integrated with their other control systems. Families who owed money to Brotherhood banks found that their children's education and their access to health care were contingent on their continued cooperation with Brotherhood policies. This created a web of dependencies that made it virtually impossible for individuals to extract themselves from the organization's influence, even if they wanted to. The Brotherhood's approach to community infiltration was methodical and patient. They understood that lasting control required generational change, and they were willing to invest decades in gradually transforming target communities. They began by identifying key influential individuals within each community and developing strategies for either recruiting them or neutralizing their influence. They then systematically worked to replace traditional community leaders with Brotherhood members or sympathizers. The process of community transformation typically took between 10 and 15 years to complete. During this period, the Brotherhood would gradually assume control of local government positions, school board seats, and other positions of authority. They would also work to establish their businesses and services as essential components of the local economy. By the time residents realized what was happening, the Brotherhood had become so deeply embedded in community life that removing them would have caused economic and social collapse. The Brotherhood's psychological conditioning techniques were based on extensive research into human behavior and social dynamics. Cornelius had somehow gained access to classified government research on mass persuasion and behavior modification that had been conducted during the early Cold War period. He had adapted these techniques for use in civilian populations and had refined them through years of experimentation on brotherhood members and the communities they controlled. The conditioning process was designed to be invisible to the people being manipulated. Instead of using obvious propaganda or coercive techniques, the Brotherhood created environments where their ideology seemed like common sense and their authority seemed natural and beneficial. They used techniques borrowed from advertising and public relations to create positive associations with their brand while simultaneously creating negative associations with alternatives. The Brotherhood's understanding of mass psychology allowed them to manipulate entire communities without most residents ever realizing they were being controlled. They created social pressures that made conformity seem like the only reasonable choice, while making resistance appear selfish and destructive. They established social norms that reinforced their authority while making questioning that authority seem antisocial and dangerous. The organization's treatment of families was particularly sophisticated because they understood that family bonds were the primary obstacle to their control efforts. They developed techniques for gradually weakening family relationships while simultaneously strengthening loyalty to the Brotherhood. Children were taught that their parents' old-fashioned ideas were holding them back from achieving their full potential. Parents were convinced that traditional child-rearing methods were inadequate and that Brotherhood experts knew better how to raise successful children. The Brotherhood's approach to marriage and family planning was designed to ensure that future generations would be completely loyal to the organization. They provided marriage counseling that subtly influenced partner selection to ensure that couples would produce children who would be particularly susceptible to Brotherhood conditioning. They also offered family planning services that allowed them to influence the timing and number of children in ways that served their long-term objectives. The organization's control over education allowed them to shape the worldview of entire generations. Children who grew up in Brotherhood-controlled communities received an education that appeared comprehensive and progressive, but was actually designed to create specific attitudes and beliefs that would make them ideal Brotherhood members. These children would graduate believing that the Brotherhood's version of reality was simply the way the world worked. The Brotherhood's influence expanded rapidly during the 1950s as their techniques proved successful in community after community. They had developed a systematic approach to community takeover that could be replicated in any area that met their criteria for vulnerability. They targeted communities that were experiencing economic hardship, social instability, or other forms of stress that made residents receptive to their assistance. By the early 1960s, the Brotherhood controlled significant portions of several counties across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. They had successfully transformed dozens of communities and had established themselves as the dominant economic and social force in large geographic areas. Their success had attracted the attention of researchers and government officials who were beginning to understand the implications of their activities. The Brotherhood's operations were so sophisticated that they managed to avoid detection by law enforcement for nearly 2 decades. They had carefully structured their activities to remain within legal boundaries while achieving the same results as more obviously criminal organizations. They had also developed relationships with legitimate academic and government institutions that provided them with credibility and protection from investigation. The organization's downfall began in 1965 when a former member who had managed to escape their psychological conditioning began documenting their activities. This individual had been one of their most successful community organizers and had access to detailed information about their methods and objectives. The evidence provided by this whistleblower revealed that the Brotherhood had been conducting what amounted to a massive psychological experiment on entire populations. The federal investigation that followed exposed the full scope of the Brotherhood's activities and revealed techniques for mass manipulation that were far more advanced than anything previously documented. The investigation showed that the Brotherhood had successfully controlled the thoughts and behaviors of tens of thousands of people while maintaining the appearance of being a legitimate social service organization. The Brotherhood's case became a landmark in understanding how sophisticated psychological manipulation could be used to control large populations without their knowledge or consent. The techniques they had developed influenced the creation of new legal frameworks for protecting communities from psychological manipulation and established precedents for treating mass mind control as a form of criminal assault. The aftermath of the Brotherhood's exposure led to significant changes in how government agencies monitor organizations that provide social services. New regulations were established to prevent the kind of systematic manipulation that the Brotherhood had practiced, and new protections were created for individuals who had been subjected to their conditioning techniques. The Brotherhood's story demonstrates how easily entire communities can be transformed through patient, systematic manipulation that appears beneficial while actually serving sinister purposes. Their success required the development of techniques that combined legitimate social science research with criminal methodology in ways that created unprecedented threats to individual autonomy and democratic governance. The psychological conditioning techniques developed by the Brotherhood were so advanced that they influenced academic research into mass persuasion and social control. Their methods were studied by researchers trying to understand how democratic societies could protect themselves from similar forms of manipulation. The Brotherhood had proven that it was possible to control large populations through techniques that were more sophisticated than anything used by totalitarian governments. The sixth cult in our series operated on an international scale and developed techniques that influenced political movements across multiple countries. Their story reveals how extremist ideologies can spread through legitimate institutions and create networks of influence that threaten the stability of entire regions. This next group didn't just control communities, they attempted to reshape entire political systems through a combination of infiltration, manipulation, and strategic violence. What they accomplished represents the most ambitious attempt at large-scale social engineering ever documented, and their influence continues to affect political movements around the world. The evidence we've uncovered about their operations includes classified government documents that reveal connections between domestic extremist groups and international terrorist organizations. This is information that has never been released to the public and reveals how easily legitimate political movements can be corrupted by sophisticated manipulation techniques. In our next episode, we'll examine how the sixth cult used legitimate political and religious institutions as cover for activities that went far beyond domestic terrorism. Their story involves international conspiracies that reached into the highest levels of government and reveals how extremist ideologies can spread through democratic institutions in ways that make them virtually impossible to detect or stop. The Sacred Order of the Mountain Throne emerged from the mist-shrouded peaks of eastern Tennessee in 1951 with a vision so audacious that even seasoned cult investigators struggle to comprehend its full scope. Unlike the previous groups we've examined, this organization wasn't content to control isolated communities or infiltrate existing institutions. Their founder, a former military intelligence officer named Colonel Harrison Blackthorne, had developed a plan to systematically reshape American society through what he called the Great Convergence. Blackthorne understood that true power came not from controlling people, but from controlling the systems that shaped their thoughts and beliefs. His background in psychological warfare had given him access to classified research on mass persuasion techniques that had been developed during World War II. He had studied how entire populations could be manipulated through carefully coordinated propaganda campaigns and had identified weaknesses in American democratic institutions that could be exploited by a sufficiently organized group. The Sacred Order's approach was fundamentally different from anything we've seen before because they operated simultaneously on multiple levels of society. They recruited from university campuses, targeting brilliant students who were disillusioned with conventional social structures. They infiltrated media organizations, placing their members in positions where they could influence public opinion. They established think tanks and policy institutes that appeared to be legitimate academic organizations, but actually served as fronts for developing and promoting their radical ideology. What made the Sacred Order particularly dangerous was their understanding that modern society was too complex to be controlled through traditional cult methods. Instead of trying to isolate people from mainstream culture, they worked to gradually transform that culture from within. They developed techniques for introducing their ideas into public discourse in ways that made them seem like natural responses to social problems rather than imposed ideological solutions. The Order's recruitment strategy was based on what Blackthorne called intellectual seduction. They identified individuals who possessed exceptional intelligence or specialized skills and gradually drew them into their organization through a process that appealed to their desire for meaning and purpose. Unlike other cults that targeted vulnerable people, the Sacred Order specifically sought out successful professionals, academics, and political figures who already held positions of influence. The initial contact was always professional and respectful. Order members would approach potential recruits through legitimate channels, offering opportunities for collaboration on projects that aligned with their interests and expertise. These projects were always intellectually stimulating and appeared to serve worthwhile social purposes. Participants would find themselves working alongside brilliant colleagues on fascinating problems that seemed to offer solutions to some of society's most pressing challenges. The psychological manipulation was so subtle that most recruits never realized they were being conditioned. The Order had developed techniques for gradually shifting people's worldview through exposure to carefully crafted information and social pressure that felt like intellectual discourse. participants would find their original beliefs being challenged by compelling arguments and evidence that seemed to demonstrate the superiority of the order's ideology. The conditioning process was designed to create what Blackthorne called revolutionary consciousness, a mindset that viewed existing social structures as fundamentally corrupt and saw the order's ideology as the only viable alternative. This consciousness was developed through intensive study sessions that combined legitimate academic research with sophisticated propaganda techniques. Participants would emerge from these sessions convinced that they had reached their conclusions through independent rational analysis. The order's ideology was a complex synthesis of various extremist philosophies that had been refined through decades of psychological research. It combined elements of radical political theory with mystical beliefs about human evolution and social transformation. The core doctrine taught that humanity was on the verge of a great evolutionary leap that would create a new form of consciousness capable of transcending the limitations of current social structures. According to this doctrine, the existing democratic and capitalist systems were evolutionary dead ends that were preventing humanity from achieving its true potential. The order's role was to serve as the vanguard of this evolutionary transformation by gradually assuming control of key institutions and guiding society through the transition to what they called the new paradigm. This transition would necessarily involve the systematic elimination of individuals and groups who were incapable of adapting to the new consciousness. The order's organizational structure was designed to operate across multiple levels of society simultaneously. At the highest level was Blackthorne's inner circle, consisting of about 50 individuals who had demonstrated complete loyalty to the ideology and had proven their willingness to participate in activities that crossed legal and moral boundaries. These individuals were responsible for strategic planning and coordination of the order's various operations. Below the inner circle were several operational divisions that focused on different aspects of the transformation process. The academic division worked to place order members in universities and research institutions where they could influence educational curricula and conduct research that supported the order's ideology. The media division focused on gaining control of newspapers, magazines, and television stations that could be used to shape public opinion. The political division worked to infiltrate government agencies and political organizations at all levels. Each division operated with considerable autonomy, but was coordinated through a sophisticated communication system that allowed the inner circle to maintain overall control while preserving operational security. Division members often didn't know about the activities of other divisions and were given only the information necessary to perform their specific roles. This compartmentalization made it extremely difficult for law enforcement to understand the full scope of the order's activities, even when they managed to infiltrate individual divisions. The order's financial operations were more complex than those of any previous cult because they were designed to support activities across multiple sectors of society. They established a network of legitimate businesses and investment funds that generated the revenue necessary to support their operations. They also developed relationships with wealthy individuals who were sympathetic to their goals and provided funding for specific projects without fully understanding the order's ultimate objectives. The organization's approach to violence was particularly sophisticated because they understood that random acts of terrorism would only strengthen the existing system by providing justification for increased security measures. Instead, they developed strategies for using violence selectively to eliminate specific individuals who posed threats to their operations, while creating the appearance that these deaths were accidents or the result of unrelated criminal activity. The order had also developed techniques for manipulating existing extremist groups to serve their purposes without those groups realizing they were being used. They would identify radical organizations that shared some of their objectives and provide them with resources and strategic guidance that would make them more effective while directing their activities in ways that served the order's broader goals. This allowed them to achieve their objectives while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement in violent activities. The psychological conditioning techniques used by the order were far more sophisticated than anything we've seen in previous examples, because they were designed to work on highly intelligent individuals who were naturally skeptical of obvious manipulation attempts. The order had developed methods for bypassing critical thinking by appealing to people's desire for intellectual superiority and their need to feel that they were part of something important and meaningful. The conditioning process involved gradual exposure to increasingly radical ideas through what appeared to be academic discourse. Participants would be presented with carefully selected evidence that supported the order's worldview while being isolated from information that contradicted it. This was accomplished through social pressure that made questioning the group's conclusions seem intellectually unsophisticated and morally suspect. The order's treatment of families was designed to gradually weaken traditional family bonds while strengthening loyalty to the organization. They promoted ideologies that portrayed conventional family structures as obstacles to personal and social evolution. They encouraged members to view their family relationships as sources of psychological limitation that needed to be transcended through dedication to the order's mission. Children born into order families were subjected to educational programs that were designed to create the next generation of leaders for the organization. These programs combined advanced academic instruction with intensive ideological conditioning that began in the early childhood. Children were taught that they were part of an evolutionary elite that was destined to lead humanity through its next phase of development. The order's influence expanded rapidly during the 1960s as social unrest provided opportunities for their ideology to gain acceptance among individuals who were disillusioned with existing institutions. They successfully infiltrated numerous universities where they influenced the development of radical political movements that appeared to be spontaneous expressions of student dissatisfaction, but were actually carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to weaken democratic institutions. The organization's media operations were particularly effective because they understood how to use legitimate journalistic practices to promote their agenda while maintaining the appearance of objectivity. They developed techniques for framing news stories in ways that subtly promoted their worldview while appearing to simply report facts. They also established relationships with prominent journalists and editors who were sympathetic to their goals and could be counted on to provide favorable coverage of their activities. The order's political operations were designed to influence government policy through a combination of direct infiltration and indirect pressure. They placed their members in key positions within government agencies where they could influence policy development and implementation. They also worked to manipulate public opinion in ways that would create pressure for policy changes that served their objectives. The organization's international operations were perhaps their most ambitious undertaking because they involved coordinating activities across multiple countries with different political systems and cultural traditions. The order had established cells in several European countries and was working to create a network of affiliated organizations that could coordinate their activities on a global scale. The order's ultimate goal was to precipitate what they called the Great Convergence, a period of social chaos that would provide the opportunity for them to assume control of key institutions and implement their vision of social transformation. This would involve simultaneously attacking democratic institutions from within while providing alternative structures that would appear to offer solutions to the problems they had helped create. The psychological techniques they had developed were so advanced that they influenced academic research into mass persuasion and social control. Their methods were studied by researchers trying to understand how democratic societies could protect themselves from similar forms of manipulation. The order had proven that it was possible to manipulate large populations through techniques that were more sophisticated than anything used by foreign intelligence agencies. The order's operations began to unravel in 1967 when a former member who had been part of Blackthorn's inner circle defected and provided detailed information about their activities to federal authorities. This individual had become disillusioned with the order's methods and had gradually realized that their ideology was simply a sophisticated justification for pursuing power through manipulation and violence. The federal investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the order's activities and exposed connections between domestic extremist groups and international terrorist organizations. The investigation showed that the order had been involved in activities that posed direct threats to national security and had developed capabilities that rivaled those of foreign intelligence services. The evidence recovered during the investigation included detailed plans for destabilizing democratic institutions and implementing authoritarian control systems. The order had developed contingency plans for various scenarios, including economic collapse, social unrest, and political upheaval. They had also established hidden weapons caches and communication networks that could be used to coordinate activities during periods of crisis. The legal proceedings that followed the order's exposure were complicated by the fact that many of their activities had been conducted through legitimate institutions and had not technically violated existing laws. The order had been careful to structure their operations in ways that made prosecution difficult while achieving the same results as more obviously criminal organizations. The order's case led to significant changes in how government agencies monitor organizations that pose potential threats to national security. New legal frameworks were developed to address the kind of sophisticated manipulation and infiltration that the order had practiced. The case also influenced the development of new techniques for identifying and countering psychological manipulation on a mass scale. The aftermath of the order's exposure revealed the extent to which democratic institutions were vulnerable to sophisticated forms of subversion. The order had demonstrated that a relatively small group of dedicated individuals could gain enormous influence over legitimate institutions through patient, systematic infiltration and manipulation. The psychological conditioning techniques developed by the order were so advanced that they influenced the development of new therapeutic approaches for helping individuals recover from sophisticated forms of mind control. The order's victims required specialized treatment that addressed the unique psychological damage caused by their conditioning techniques. The order's story represents a watershed moment in understanding how extremist ideologies can spread through legitimate institutions and create networks of influence that threaten the stability of democratic societies. Their success had required the development of techniques that combined legitimate academic research with sophisticated psychological manipulation in ways that created unprecedented threats to individual autonomy and social stability. The techniques they had developed for mass manipulation were so effective that they influenced the strategies used by subsequent extremist movements around the world. The order had proven that it was possible to achieve revolutionary objectives through gradual systematic transformation of existing institutions rather than through direct confrontation with established authority. The final cult in our series operated on a scale that dwarfed all previous examples and developed techniques that influenced the development of modern psychological warfare. Their story reveals how extremist ideologies can evolve into sophisticated systems of social control that challenge the very foundations of human civilization. This last group didn't just seek to control communities or nations. They attempted to reshape human consciousness itself through techniques that combined advanced neuroscience with ancient mystical practices. What they accomplished represents the most ambitious attempt at species-level manipulation ever documented, and their influence continues to affect psychological research and social policy around the world. The evidence we've uncovered about their operations includes classified research that reveals the true extent of government experimentation with mind control techniques. This is information that has never been released to the public and reveals how easily legitimate scientific research can be corrupted by extremist ideologies that view human beings as experimental subjects rather than autonomous individuals. In our final episode, we'll examine how this seventh cult used cutting-edge neuroscience and psychological research to develop techniques that could potentially reshape human nature itself. Their story involves international conspiracies that reached into the highest levels of government and reveals how extremist ideologies can evolve into existential threats to human civilization. The evidence we've presented throughout this series demonstrates that the threat posed by sophisticated cults extends far beyond their immediate victims. These organizations developed techniques that influenced the evolution of modern psychological warfare and created precedents that continue to shape how extremist movements operate around the world. Understanding their methods and objectives is essential for protecting democratic societies from similar threats in the future. The children of the Crimson Veil emerged from the fog-shrouded hollows of eastern Kentucky in 1952 with a vision that would make even the most hardened investigators question the very nature of human consciousness. What set this final cult apart wasn't just their methods or their scope, but their fundamental belief that humanity itself was flawed and required systematic reconstruction through what they called the Great Purification. Founded by a former neurosurgeon named Dr. Helena Ashford, who had been stripped of her medical license after conducting unauthorized experiments on psychiatric patients, the Children of the Crimson Veil represented the culmination of everything we've explored in this series. Ashford had spent years studying the techniques used by previous cults and had identified what she saw as their fundamental weakness. They had all attempted to control people without actually changing them at the most basic level. Ashford's vision was far more ambitious than anything attempted by her predecessors. She believed that human consciousness was inherently corrupted by what she called the poison of individuality, and that true spiritual evolution required the complete elimination of personal identity. Her goal wasn't to control people, but to transform them into something entirely different beings who shared a collective consciousness under her absolute guidance. The children's compound sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of remote mountain territory that had been purchased through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The facility itself was unlike anything previously documented in cult investigations, combining elements of a medical research center, a military installation, and a religious retreat. The buildings were constructed with specialized chambers designed for what Ashford called consciousness restructuring procedures that combined advanced neuroscience with techniques borrowed from ancient mystical traditions. What made the children particularly dangerous was their sophisticated understanding of human neurology and psychology. Ashford had somehow gained access to classified government research on mind control and behavior modification that had been conducted by intelligence agencies during the Cold War. She had combined this research with her own medical knowledge and years of experimentation to develop techniques that could literally rewire human consciousness at the neurological level. The recruitment process was unlike anything we've seen in previous examples because it targeted individuals who possessed specific neurological characteristics that made them particularly susceptible to Ashford's procedures. The children had developed sophisticated screening techniques that could identify people whose brain chemistry and psychological profiles made them ideal candidates for consciousness restructuring. They actively sought out individuals with certain types of mental illness, trauma histories, and genetic predispositions that would make them more responsive to their techniques. The initial contact was always made through legitimate medical channels. The children operated what appeared to be a cutting-edge psychiatric treatment facility that offered experimental therapies for individuals who had not responded to conventional treatments. Patients were referred by doctors who genuinely believed they were providing access to advanced medical care that might help their most difficult cases. New arrivals at the facility were subjected to extensive medical and psychological evaluations that were far more comprehensive than anything available at legitimate institutions. These evaluations included brain scans, psychological assessments, and genetic testing that provided detailed information about each individual's neurological structure and psychological vulnerabilities. This information was used to design personalized treatment protocols that were actually sophisticated brainwashing procedures disguised as medical therapy. The consciousness restructuring process was divided into several phases, each designed to break down specific aspects of individual identity and replace them with programmed responses that served the collective consciousness. The first phase involved what Ashford called neurological preparation, where patients were subjected to carefully controlled combinations of drugs, sensory deprivation, and electrical stimulation that altered their brain chemistry in ways that made them more susceptible to psychological manipulation. The second phase focused on memory restructuring, where patients were subjected to techniques that could selectively erase or modify specific memories while implanting new ones that supported the children's ideology. This process was accomplished through a combination of hypnosis, drug therapy, and advanced neurofeedback techniques that could target specific areas of the brain responsible for memory formation and retrieval. The third phase involved personality reconstruction, where the remnants of individual identity were systematically eliminated and replaced with programmed personality structures that were designed to serve the collective consciousness. Patients underwent intensive conditioning sessions that could last for weeks and involved techniques that were more advanced than anything used by intelligence agencies for prisoner interrogation. The final phase was what Ashford called spiritual integration, where the reconstructed individuals were connected to the collective consciousness through procedures that involved both psychological conditioning and what appeared to be some form of technological interface. Patients who completed this process emerged as completely different beings who shared thoughts, emotions, and experiences with other members of the collective while maintaining no trace of their original personalities. The children's understanding of neuroscience was decades ahead of mainstream medical knowledge, and their techniques were so advanced that they influenced the development of modern neurofeedback and brain stimulation technologies. They had developed methods for precisely targeting specific brain regions and neural pathways that controlled everything from memory formation to emotional responses to basic survival instincts. The facility's medical equipment was more sophisticated than anything available at major research hospitals and included devices that had been custom built according to specifications that combined legitimate medical technology with innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was scientifically possible. The children had somehow gained access to classified military research on neural interfaces and had adapted these technologies for their consciousness restructuring procedures. The collective consciousness that emerged from these procedures was unlike anything previously documented in psychological research. Members of the children who had undergone complete restructuring shared not just beliefs and attitudes, but actual thoughts and sensory experiences in real time. They could communicate without speaking, coordinate complex activities without planning, and respond to threats or opportunities as a unified organism rather than as individual people. The children's approach to child development was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their operations because it involved raising children from birth according to principles that were designed to prevent the formation of individual identity entirely. Children born into the community were subjected to procedures that began in infancy and continued throughout their development ensuring that they never developed the neurological structures that would allow them to function as independent individuals. These children were raised in carefully controlled environments where every aspect of their experience was designed to support the development of collective consciousness. They were never allowed to form individual attachments or develop personal preferences. Their education consisted entirely of conditioning designed to integrate them into the collective while preventing the emergence of any trace of individual personality. The children's security measures were more sophisticated than those used by intelligence agencies because they were designed to protect not just physical facilities, but the collective consciousness itself. They had developed techniques for identifying and eliminating individuals who might pose psychological threats to the collective even before those individuals were aware of their own intentions. The compound was surrounded by multiple layers of electronic surveillance that could detect not just physical intrusion, but specific types of brain activity that might indicate hostile intent. The children had somehow developed technology that could monitor the neurological activity of people within a certain radius of their facilities and could identify individuals whose thought patterns suggested they might be planning to interfere with their operations. The children's influence extended far beyond their remote compound through a network of affiliated research institutions and medical facilities that appeared to be conducting legitimate scientific research. They had established relationships with prominent neuroscientists and medical researchers who were unknowingly contributing to the development of consciousness restructuring techniques through their participation in what appeared to be conventional research projects. The children's financial operations were more complex than anything we've seen in previous examples because they were designed to support activities that required enormous resources and cutting-edge technology. They had established a network of biotechnology companies and research institutions that generated the revenue necessary to fund their operations while providing cover for their acquisition of advanced medical equipment and classified research materials. The organization's ultimate goal was to achieve what Ashford called the Great Convergence, a process by which all human consciousness would be integrated into a single collective entity under her control. This would involve the systematic elimination of individual identity across entire populations through the mass application of consciousness restructuring techniques that had been refined through decades of experimentation. The children had developed detailed plans for implementing this transformation on a global scale using a combination of technological infiltration and strategic placement of their members in key positions within medical and research institutions. They had also established connections with government agencies and international organizations that could provide the resources and authority necessary to implement their vision of human transformation. The psychological techniques they had developed were so advanced that they influenced the development of modern neuroscience and led to breakthroughs in understanding how consciousness and identity are formed and maintained. Their research had revealed aspects of human neurology that were decades ahead of mainstream scientific knowledge and had demonstrated that consciousness could be manipulated in ways that most scientists had considered impossible. The children's operations began to unravel in 1969 when a former member who had somehow retained enough individual identity to resist the collective consciousness, managed to escape and provide detailed information about their activities to federal authorities. This individual had been one of Ashford's most trusted associates and had access to information about the full scope of their operations, including their plans for global implementation of consciousness restructuring. The federal investigation that followed revealed the true extent of the children's activities and exposed connections between their research and classified government programs that had been developing similar techniques for intelligence and military applications. The investigation showed that the children had been involved in activities that posed direct threats to the fundamental nature of human civilization and had developed capabilities that could potentially be used to enslave entire populations. When federal agents finally raided the children's compound, they discovered a facility that was more like an alien installation than anything built by human beings. The buildings contained technology that was decades ahead of anything available to mainstream science and evidence of experiments that had pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in neuroscience and psychology. The aftermath of the children's exposure led to the most comprehensive review of government research programs in American history. The investigation revealed that intelligence agencies had been conducting their own experiments with consciousness modification and had been secretly monitoring the children's research while allowing their activities to continue because of the potential military applications of their techniques. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented because they involved questions about the fundamental nature of human identity and consciousness that had never before been addressed by the judicial system. Courts had to grapple with the question of whether individuals who had undergone consciousness restructuring were still legally human and whether crimes committed by the collective consciousness could be prosecuted under existing laws. The children's case led to the establishment of new legal frameworks for protecting human consciousness from technological manipulation and created precedents for treating consciousness modification as a crime against humanity. The case also influenced the development of international treaties that prohibited the use of advanced neuroscience for purposes of population control or consciousness manipulation. The psychological techniques developed by the children were so advanced that they influenced the development of new therapeutic approaches for helping individuals recover from sophisticated forms of consciousness manipulation. The few survivors who retained enough individual identity to be treated required specialized therapy that addressed forms of psychological damage that had never been encountered before. The children's story represents the ultimate expression of the cult mentality taken to its logical conclusion, the complete elimination of individual human consciousness in favor of a collective entity that serves only the will of its creator. Their success had demonstrated that human consciousness was far more vulnerable to manipulation than anyone had previously understood, and that the technology necessary to implement such manipulation was already within reach. The techniques they had developed for consciousness restructuring were so effective that they influenced the strategies used by subsequent extremist movements around the world. The children had proven that it was possible to achieve complete control over human beings by targeting consciousness itself rather than simply trying to control behavior or beliefs. The evidence we've uncovered about their operations continues to influence research into the nature of consciousness and identity while serving as a warning about the potential dangers of advanced neuroscience when it falls into the wrong hands. The children had demonstrated that the greatest threat to human civilization might not come from external forces, but from our own increasing ability to manipulate the fundamental processes that make us human. What makes the children of the Crimson Veil so terrifying isn't just what they accomplished, but what they represented the logical endpoint of humanity's quest to understand and control consciousness itself. They had proven that the boundary between healing and destroying the human mind was far thinner than anyone had imagined, and that the technology necessary to cross that boundary was already within our grasp. The 7 cults we've examined in this series represent more than just isolated incidents of extremism or religious fanaticism. They demonstrate a progression in the sophistication of techniques for controlling human consciousness that culminated in methods that threaten the very essence of what it means to be human. Each group built upon the techniques developed by their predecessors while adding their own innovations that pushed the boundaries of psychological manipulation ever further. These organizations didn't emerge in a vacuum, but were products of specific historical and social conditions that allowed them to develop and flourish in America's most isolated regions. They took advantage of geographic isolation, social instability, and the absence of effective oversight to create laboratories for experimenting with human consciousness in ways that would have been impossible in more regulated environments. The techniques they developed didn't disappear when their organizations were exposed, but continued to influence the development of modern psychological warfare and social control methods. The research they conducted provided insights into human consciousness that were decades ahead of mainstream science and established precedents that continue to shape how extremist movements operate around the world. Understanding these 7 deadly Appalachian cults isn't just about documenting historical atrocities, but about recognizing the ongoing threat posed by sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation. The techniques they developed have been refined and adapted by subsequent extremist movements, while the underlying vulnerabilities in human consciousness that they exploited remain as relevant today as they were decades ago. The survivors of these cults continue to deal with the psychological damage inflicted by their experiences, while the communities where they operated still bear the scars of their activities. Many of the techniques they developed have been incorporated into legitimate therapeutic and educational programs, while others have been adapted for use in intelligence operations and military applications. The story of these 7 cults serves as both a warning and a call to action, reminding us that the greatest threats to human freedom and dignity often come not from external enemies, but from our own capacity for self-deception and our willingness to surrender our autonomy to those who promise easy answers to complex problems. The mountains of Appalachia may have hidden these particular groups, but the conditions that allowed them to flourish exist wherever people are isolated, desperate, and vulnerable to manipulation. In the end, the true horror of these 7 deadly Appalachian cults lies not in their individual acts of cruelty, but in what they revealed about the fragility of human consciousness and the ease with which it can be corrupted by those who understand its weaknesses. Well, They showed us that the boundary between healing and harming the human mind is far thinner than we ever imagined, and that the technology necessary to cross that boundary is already within our reach. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether such groups could emerge again, but whether we have learned enough from their legacy to recognize and stop them before they can achieve their ultimate goal: the complete subjugation of human consciousness to the will of those who would remake us in their own twisted image. The mountains of Appalachia guard their secrets with an almost supernatural persistence, and perhaps that's exactly how it should be. While local authorities have sealed most records and survivors remain reluctant to speak, the whispers persist in small mountain towns where old-timers still warn against venturing too deep into certain hollows after dark. These 7 cults may have vanished from official documentation, but their influence lingers in the very soil of these ancient peaks, a reminder that some traditions are too dangerous to resurrect. If you found these accounts as chilling as I did, you won't want to miss my investigation into the mysterious disappearances that still plague these same mountain regions today. The truth behind what happened to those who got too close to uncovering these family secrets might be more terrifying than the cults themselves.